So this is great. It's very exciting to be part of a panel. This was the dream when I was at Force 2 years ago, or whenever it was in Amsterdam several years ago, and this was one of hearing the word sort of inclusivity, hearing mentions of the public sort of over and over again. We heard it yesterday already, and hearing it repeated first in Cassidy's talk and now again with the other panelists. So this is really exciting to be here. And again, I also want to reiterate my thanks for the travel fellowship to be able to participate and be here, as well as the invitation to be on this panel. I'm Juan Pablo Alperin. I'm an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University now. I've been working with the Public Knowledge Project actually for almost 10 years. And I've been working on looking at scholarly communications in Latin America. I started out first doing some software development for developing the Open Journal Systems platform, which is used by about 9,000 sort of journals, most of them in the developing world. And then started doing research and ended up doing my PhD looking at scholarly communications in Latin America, because I saw that there was a tremendous need to help to support and strengthen what was already happening in the region. And I've gone on now to look at areas in which part of what I want to talk about today is looking at who are the publics that are using this work, because the research that was being done around Latin America was all very much about who was producing and where were the journals and what fields, and it was sort of a study of the production of journals, but there was very little work done around what the usage was. And what I want to talk a little bit about today is some of, especially those non-scholar, non-researcher audiences, which we've already started hearing a little bit about in the other presentations. As Dominique said, I think this is, but I want to just emphasize and reiterate, this is, one of the greatest transformations sort of in scholarly communications in the global north has been this push for open access, right? And in Latin America, this has just been the reality since even before the internet even existed, right? We've had open access, or some version of open access, even in an era when there was only printed journals. There was a barter system in place between the libraries, and people would sort of exchange journals, and they would distribute them as openly as they could with the technology of what was available at the time. And when it came time to put things online, it was just a natural thing to do, to just start trying to put everything available openly. And this part of it about being open has never been one that has been sort of challenged, or definitely not challenged as strongly as it has been in the North. It is the reality that we have, the different estimates, but over 70, 80, 90% of the journals that are open access, or I like to say at least they're publicly accessible. There's a lot of confusion sometimes around what licenses, as things are published in multiple places, but they're at least publicly accessible. And this is, 80% of the literature in an entire region of the world that is published in open access. So this is, when you're trying to push for open access in the North, this is a region of the world that has already been doing this. And it's something that when I bring this up over and over again at different scholarly communication events, something that people are very surprised to hear, that, it's like, what, open access is already, you have an entire region where you have 3 countries that have passed laws and legislation to promote open access, and you have thousands of journals that are publishing in open access. This is something that sort of catches people off guard, and I asked the question, what I wanted to talk a little bit about today, some of the lessons that we can learn by looking at, okay, how does this work? How did they do this? And what are the outcomes when you have an entire region of the world that publishes the majority of their research as open access, which means that the public also has the expectation that the research is open access. It's not something that the public expects that this is closed knowledge. And so what I found in Latin America, and what I did for my dissertation work, is to look at Latin America as a bit of a natural experiment, right? You have a region of the world that has a common language, there's a couple of languages, but for the most part, sort of Spanish-speaking region where you have a whole bunch of different countries, different size institutions. You have all kinds of areas of knowledge that are being published. All open access, it's been like that for so long that the public has an expectation that research that's made available is public. And so it opens up the question, well, if you have this situation where you have thousands of journals being published in a region of the world where the institutions were intended to support the public good, does the public actually want to read this work? So I went about studying this with 2 other portals that Dominique mentioned. Red Lake is one of them, right, where you have, they collectively publish at around 1,500 journals. At the time that I conducted the study, it was around 1,300 between the 2 of them. And when someone was reading an article, after they were on that page where the article was presented for, I think it was 10 seconds, a little question would come up that said, I work in, and they would have the option of answering at a university, in the private sector, for the government, at an NGO. I'm a student, or other, right? And I actually asked different variations on this same question. I asked in different ways to try to understand what are the sort of, asking where do they work, but also I'm interested in this article for, or I'm interested in this research because, right? And trying to understand really this distinction between the public use and the academic use. This is sort of the question that, when Cassidy was talking earlier around how do we identify who are the members of the public? Well, right on the journal platforms, because they collaborated on this project, they allowed me to sort of put a question where I could just directly ask them, are you a member of the public, right? And so that seems like a fairly good way to try to get at the answer. And so I had a sample of, so on the Redalyc portal, this is, I wasn't going to list all of the countries, but there in Redalyc, it's centralized in one, all at redalyc.org. You have a whole bunch of different countries in Latin America, journals that are primarily published in those regions or that are associated with those regions. I received around almost 70,000 responses, so I had 4 different questions. I asked this sort of the same thing in 4 different ways, so about 18,000 responses per question. About 38% of the people that saw that pop-up actually answered their question on Redalyc. On the Cielo, there's around in a lot of countries in Latin America, but each site has a different URL, and I just only put the surveys on 3 of them, in the Brazil site, the Chile, and the Mexico site. And I asked there, because they have a bit higher traffic, over the same time period that I asked the question, I received almost 176,000 responses. So that's 44,000 responses per time for each one of those 4 questions that I asked. And almost half of the people on the Cielo site asked it. And I actually think this has to do with the fact that of how the web pages look. The Cielo site looks like it's an older kind of web page, and I think that people were sort of more ready to accept and answer the questions. It's actually a little unclear why there's such a difference in the response rate, but I think it has to do with sort of an old-looking site. People felt like they should answer the question to be able to go on, and on the nicer, sort of more beautiful Redalyc site, people were like a little more dismissive of it. But clearly, 44,000 respondents per question and a 50% almost response rate gives me some sense that at least these responses and the numbers are somewhat credible. You like how I'm keeping you in suspense about the answer for as long as possible? Okay, this is intentional. So this is what I found. I found, first of all, that the largest group that uses the Latin American journals are students, right? And so here you have a question around, this is journals that are primarily published in the local languages, so in the Brazilian case in Portuguese, and the other countries primarily in Spanish. And students are accessing all of this work as they're doing their research for their classes. And I have, if you want to look at my dissertation, you can see some of the breakdown on what sort of level of study they were at, because for I directed people to a demographic survey where I collected a little bit more information about them. But from these pop-up questions, and this is a composite of the different responses, I just try to sort of aggregate and summarize, because obviously each question had slightly different numbers for each, but about 50–55% of the people were students. And then university staff, and here is probably primarily faculty, but because the questions were worded sort of, I work at a university, I don't want to presume that those are just faculty. It could be anyone working at the university. Made up, so this is your typical, this is what you envision when you're thinking about who is reading research, right? This is your professors, assistant professors, and so on. Only made up 22 to 25% of the people reading the research and accessing it. What we find is then on the public side, 6 to 9%, depending again on the question, were for asking for personal use. There were people saying, I'm researching for personal reasons, or they work from, or they're accessing it because they're interested because of something that's external to their job and external to their work as an academic. And for professional practice reasons, so again, here I would break it down by different sectors, but when you aggregate the numbers from the different sectors, you find 17 to 20% are coming at and looking at the research for professional practice reasons. So this, sums up, if you sum up the public side of this, about a quarter or so of their accesses and downloads of open access research from Latin America is coming from non-academics. Right? And this is despite, these journals have not been written in the beautiful prose that Pinker was describing earlier. These are just journals that were intended for scholarly dissemination. Right, so they're intended for an academic audience, but the public, still 25% of the downloads are coming from the public. You can look at, these are sort of two of the individual questions, right, where you look at place of work, again, so you have the students are at 50%, universities, so you kind of get the same sense for like the breakdown by the questions, or reasons for being interested in this article. You would ask for academic reasons, personal, professional practice, and so on. Again, all accessing primary literature that was written, and it's peer-reviewed in some of the best journals from Latin America. When you look by discipline, you see some variance. When you start, you might think, some of the fields that you think would be of public interest, maybe the arts and humanities, they end up having smaller amounts of public use than fields like health and agriculture. So perhaps not surprising to some, but looking at the social sciences and the humanities, you start seeing different breakdowns. Although the arts and humanities, you see the personal use is higher than most of the other, sort of health and arts and humanities have some of the highest personal use, sort of accessing the research for personal reasons. And the professional practice reasons, perhaps not surprisingly, that again, the health and agriculture field are up there. But you can start to get a sense of where is, what kind of research and what kind of work is accessed by the public, what is primarily of just scholarly or academic interest. And so I think from this we learn, what I wanted to sort of end on is look at what are some of the lessons that if we in this community here are paying attention to what's happening in Latin America, what can we actually learn, right? So number one is that open access means public access. So this is a phrase that John Walitsky, who was my advisor in the book, The Access Principle, he's making the case that this is open access is public access. And what I think we learn from looking at a region of the world where you have so much open access is that the public is interested. And so when you make things open access, you're giving public access, and the public is actually coming and looking at it. The corollary of that is that you have scholarly communications. We have to think about scholarly communications as being for non-scholars as well as for scholars. So all of the things when we're building tools, when we're building new methodologies, when we are in all of the work that we're doing with the kind of things that we want to value, the kind of things we want to reward and incentivize, need to also consider that scholarly communications has to also be targeted at non-scholars because they are coming and they are interested in the work. And the third part, and this is important for me to emphasize, because in Latin America, all of this open access is done through cooperative models, right? So they're collaborative and cooperative models. And I think that the fact that this is possible, that it's possible to do wide-scale open access to research and research that's relevant to the public can be done through these cooperative and collaborative models. And just the lesson that it's possible to do it that way is something that I think we need to take away. And I've been very into meta lessons as I'm in my second year of being a professor, and as I teach classes, I'm very sort of like, okay, what do we learn about having learned these things, right? So then I try to always be emphasizing the practice of what we're doing. And then I think that, and this is again very much echoing what Cassidy was saying this morning, that perhaps some of our biggest challenges, right, for all of the things that we're doing around trying to do semantic linking and machine-readable things, all of the stuff that we are all very concerned with, that perhaps one of our biggest challenges is to adjust our practices and adjusting our values to really be inclusive. And here it's inclusive in every sense. So it's inclusive of different people participating, right, on who gets to participate in the knowledge creation, inclusive of who gets to participate in conversations around what should scholarly communications look like and what kind of things we should do. It's inclusiveness around what voices we allow to influence the work that we do, around who deciding. And these are the questions that were asked by Laura, those sort of provocative questions. It's all about inclusivity in the broadest sense of the term. Thank you.